preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Welcome to this, the last in the series Looking to the Jewish Future, which is celebrating the 10th anniversary of Shema. A number of announcements. Number one, for those of you that may not have received our letters, as you know, Rabbi Schulweis was ill and could not appear last Monday evening. For those of you that would like refunds, you're asked to take your ticket to the box office and they will give you a refund. We'd also like to ask you that at least you consider taking your ticket as a tax-deductible contribution to Shema. We have sponsored this jointly with Shema to celebrate these first 10 years of its existence, and we will be transferring the money that we have received to Shema to help it in its ongoing work. So you're both invited, if you choose, to use your ticket and ask for a refund at the box office, or we will be transferring the money to Shema within the next week or two. Two announcements. Beginning on March the 17th, on successive Tuesday evenings, Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg will be having a series entitled Jewish Dilemmas, Politics, Culture, and Belief. That's on Tuesday evenings at 8:15, beginning on March 17. One other program I just want to point out, on March 10th, I think we're going to have an interesting evening here, a program which we're sponsoring with Moment Magazine. We'll focus on anti-Semitism in America. Robert J. Lifton from Yale, Irving Levine of the American Jewish Committee, and Leonard Fine will together try to analyze the increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the last few years and its impact on American Jewish life. It is no easy task to introduce Eugene Borowitz. He is truly one of the rare persons in American Jewish life. A scholar, a rabbi, one of the most prolific writers, an editor of one of the most independent and courageous Jewish journals in this country, and a man who is truly a delight to work with in an organizing way to put together this series. So it is a privilege for me to welcome Eugene Borowitz here, and a privilege for me to introduce him to you at this point.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here, considering what happened to poor Harold. We're not quite sure how he got ill or what he is ill with, but he is at home recuperating these days, for which we are all very grateful. And we're only sorry that he wasn't able to be here with you. What I want to do this evening is, upon some reflection, to begin my remarks in relationship to those which Irving Greenberg made here 3 weeks ago. It occurred to me when we set up these series that each of us might take a rather different approach to the future of American Jewish life. Irving has had an extraordinary experience in working with organized Jewish life through his relationships with American Jewish fundraising leadership. In a way, he is the unofficial chaplain to the General Assembly of the Council of Jewish Federations and Welfare Funds of the United States. And by dint of his personality and his extraordinary range of ideas, he has been able to give our leaders in the fundraising enterprise a sense of where Judaism ought to be going in our time that has been unparalleled. There is no one in the United States, I think, who has had that kind of intellectual leadership and impact that Yitz Greenberg has had. And listening to him 3 weeks ago, I suddenly realized that his point of view was bound to have this global scope. Had Harold Schulweis been here a week ago, Perhaps he would have spoken from his particular experience, which is that of a congregational rabbi who has been extraordinarily experimental and innovative, one who has taken the old form of the synagogue that many people say is by now obsolete and has made it work again. I thought that I myself, being much more theologically and philosophically inclined, would then take a third point of view. And indeed, reflecting upon the issue, I decided that if you will allow me a certain measure of exaggeration, I will in fact allow my remarks this evening to stand as a kind of antithesis to those made by Irving Greenberg. His point of view was political and social. Mine is going to be personal and philosophical. That is to say, the future of Jewish life as Yitz saw it was to be in the way in which the organized Jewish community somehow managed finally to put together, as he put it, body and soul. He's quite concerned with this marvelous system of organizations which we have across the United States, and the way in which these would somehow deal with the grassroots phenomena which have been such an outstanding development of the 1970s. And his concern then was to see the organization of this, particularly his great dream of a Jewish think tank in which finally the best brains of the Jewish community could be brought to bear upon the many problems facing us. My thesis is that that emphasis upon organization and structure will not develop the Jewish future the way it ought to be developed, but that to the contrary, we need to pay attention more to the individual and the personal aspect of Jewish life. And that only if we come to terms with the basic questions that the individual Jew faces will we meet the major challenge of the time before us. Now, let me begin then by talking about why it seems to me, not trying to take anything away from the great Jewish organizations, what they have done, what they can yet do. Let me begin by indicating why it is that I think we should not look to them for our future, but rather to individual Jews who are seeking to work out their own destiny in their own ways. In the first place, it seems to me perfectly clear that in the past decade, in which there has been something of a return to Jewish life and a kind of a renaissance of Jewish activity and interest, that has come almost always from individuals in local areas and not from organizations. On the whole, Jewish organizations follow creative individuals. They do not lead the onward development of the American Jewish community, by which I mean to say, they will react to ideas, they will pick up ideas, they will then move these ideas out through the general community. But it is rather rare that they will somehow create a new vision or a deeper understanding of what is going on in Jewish life and project that through the community. Let's take some of the most obvious and simple cases. The Chavurah movement, the effort to try to establish face-to-face, small-scale Jewish associations in the United States, began not with any Jewish organization, but rather with people who felt that their Jewish needs were not being met. It was, if anything, in response to the failure of organizations, their inability to see that new styles and patterns of association were required, that the Chavurah movement, first in the Boston area and then rather differently in other places, spontaneously came into being. I think of an individual like Bruce Cohen, who had the idea that the only way that Jews and Arabs will ever be able to live in harmony with one another will be if Jews and Arabs start working together on small-scale projects in the land of Israel. And without any organizational help, with a dream and an idea, organized interns for peace. A man like Morris Kipper, who created the notion of Jewish students in American high schools spending a part of one of their high school years doing social studies in the land of Israel, where not only the biblical foundations of Western civilization were laid, but where various kinds of human relations could be studied and understood, to the point where today there is an ongoing, permanent program for high school students of the United States to go to the land of Israel. I could go on with a whole list of these people. When we have a good Jewish organization in the United States, like the American Jewish Committee, what makes that organization good is that it is alert to what is going on in local communities. Let us take one of my favorite departments at the American Jewish Committee, perhaps the one that I admire the most, the one run by Yehuda Rosenman, who deals with the issues of Judaizing American Jewish life. That department is sensitive to the fact that Jewish daycare is increasingly becoming an issue for Jewish families in which there are two persons working. As a result of which, they have now not only begun to sponsor a family center, the family being a major problem in the Jewish community, but they recently called a meeting to discuss what is going on in daycare. It was not that the committee invented daycare. To the contrary, they went to Detroit and Boston and 5 or 6 other communities where, in fact, individuals have been responding to real needs, and they did what organizations do. They brought them together, got the data, and are now able to spread it to other people. The interesting thing that one must remember about organizations, and the reason why I think we should not count on them for the Jewish future, is they are going to be responding to Jewish needs in any case. By which I mean, it is not that they are going to be thinking to create programs. What they are interested in doing is keeping themselves as organizations alive. And in order to have a viable future, they have to have Jews. It has come as a terrible shock to organizations like the American Jewish Committee that if there are no Jews in the next generation, there will be no American Jewish Committee. It has come as a major insight to federations and the United Jewish Appeal that if a generation of young Jews is allowed to grow up who have no real attachment or concern for the Jewish community, there will be no contributors to Jewish philanthropies. As a result of which we may count on these organizations out of simple self-interest to be involved in the development of Jewish activity, but we cannot count on them to lead it for the simple fact that their major concerns lie elsewhere. So the point of departure that I am taking this evening is that instead of being very much concerned with rationalizing Jewish life and organizing Jewish life and putting us all together, as Yitz was in his address to us 3 weeks ago, I want to start with the individual Jew. For it seems to me it has been in the creative response of individual Jews here and there to their situation, to their living situation, that Jewish life has changed over the last 10 years or so, and in my opinion, will continue to change. Now, the root question, as I see it, is how to accept the virtues of building Jewish life upon the individual, while at the same time not succumbing to the problems which occur from having a radical individualism. Let me begin with what I consider to be the inescapable premise of the Jewish future, namely, the individual in our American Jewish community has an almost absolute right to Jewish self-determination. What we are dealing with is a Jewish community where persons grow up thinking for themselves and determined to make up their own mind what they are going to do. They are most unlikely to be involved in a situation where they are going to give up this private sense of self-determination to everyone else. In the first place, that's the society of which we are a part. Our culture reinforces this notion that we ought to be self-determination. After all, what else is there to believe in today? One used to somehow think that there were people out there who were wise, or that the world knew everything, or that the university or the poets or the novelists or the playwrights or the philosophers of our time would teach us. But now we have come to the point where we recognize that sometimes they are wiser than we are and we can gain a little for them, but that in every case we ought to think for ourselves. We ought to listen to them, ponder what they say, and then make up our own minds, be true to ourselves. From the time that we are little, in our schools and our culture, we are taught to raise the terrible intellectual question, why? The right to ask why means I do not have to do what you say. It means I will listen to you, and if you have a good reason, then I may do what you say. But unless you force me or coerce me, unless you take away my dignity as a person, I want reasons. Now, Jews have a particular stake in this notion that every individual should be entitled to make up his or her mind by his or herself, because it is the basis of the Jewish right to participate in the general culture. When the Enlightenment came to Europe in the 18th century and into the 19th century, its fundamental notion was that people were to be entitled to rights because they were persons. All people who could think for themselves should be equal. That certainly meant Catholics and Protestants. And when forced, they admitted that it also included Jews. If every thinking person has a right to participate in the society, if every thinking person should have a share in government, if they should determine for themselves the structure of the social institutions of which they are a part, that means that Jews too should have a right in the society. For Jews then who want to be equal, who want to say, I am as much a person as you are, and therefore there is no reason to have disabilities against me. To take away the right of any person to be self-determining means to take away the right of Jews to claim equality with all other people. So we have a stake in personal autonomy. Our very participation in the culture requires us to be individualistic. Moreover, in fact, the Jewish community has almost overwhelmingly accepted the notion that Jews have a right to make up their own minds as to what they want to do and as to what will constitute authentic Jewishness for them. There is one exception to that rule. We have now in the United States, happily, an organic Orthodox Jewish community, a community whose parents and probably grandparents going back for generations was Orthodox Jewish. And now another generation comes along, and instead of being swayed by Western culture so that they should give up orthodoxy, this generation now accepts as natural and right that they should be Orthodox. They follow the law as interpreted by the sages, because that is how they find what to others would be called personal fulfillment. For them, those terms are meaningless. They fulfill the will of God. But in a way, one learns something about the extent to which self-determination is the root of American Jewish life by looking at two other Orthodox Jewish communities. In the first place, we have that large number of American Jews, comparatively large numbers, who have chosen to be Orthodox. Facing the crisis of Western civilization, seeing anarchy on the one hand and wishy-washy liberalism in the middle, they choose to be Orthodox Jewish, and as a result, we have a whole new group of people who are learned and observant of the law. What makes their orthodoxy different and interesting is that they are Orthodox by choice. Somewhere at the root of their psyche, they know their orthodoxy was a matter of the exercise of personal autonomy. Having chosen to be Orthodox, they might conceivably, on some other occasion, choose an alternate lifestyle, even as they have now chosen orthodoxy. Now compare that, please, to the rather larger group of Orthodox Jews. That is to say, those Orthodox Jews who affiliate with Orthodox congregations, because where else would a good Jew affiliate, but are not observant. We have an extraordinary category in American Jewish life, non-observant Orthodox. And what that involves is a situation of saying, yes, that's the standard, and I will listen to what the rabbi says, and I know that that's what goes on in the congregation, but as soon as I leave, I will do what I want. They may call themselves Orthodox, but that is a covert liberalism, and it is an indication of the extent to which even so-called Orthodox Jews in this case are in fact operating by the principle of personal choice. Now, leaving the Orthodox Jewish community, which is the hardest case, I think, it is perfectly clear that all the rest of the Jewish community, conservative, reconstructionist, reform, cultural, non-observant, assimilative, uncaring, whatever they are, operate by personal choice. They have chosen to treat Judaism this way. They feel comfortable, or to the extent that they feel uncomfortable, it is just a question of their own standards and their own values. Even for those who have decided in this extraordinary action of the past 10 years that they want to be, quotes, more Jewish, unquotes, the form that they utilize is the Jewish catalog. Now think for a moment what those 3 volumes of the Jewish catalog are like. They are resources to help one bring greater Jewishness into one's lives. They are very heavily ritualistic, very much concerned to show how activities which previous liberal generations were not interested in should now be accepted once again by people who want to be Jewish. They sound Orthodox, but in fact they are a catalog. A catalog is a book you look through, picking and choosing what you will order. We never had a catalog of Jewish commandments before. For the American Jewish community to become more Jewish, you cannot have a prepared table, a Shulchan Aruch. We are cafeteria people. And each of us, of course, is on his or her own diet, which is our personal variety of keeping kosher. Indeed, I would suggest that the more people who are liberals talk of halakha and law in the Jewish community, the more they are trying to hide from the issue that they are really concerned with personal choice, but wish there were some discipline which, on the other hand, didn't constrain them too much. And here the critical issue is the rights of women. What shall we do about the rights of Jewish women? The tradition, as it has been interpreted down through the ages, seems, without many questions, quite clear on the subordinate role of women and of their lack of major legal rights. To assert that women shall have equal rights is to break with the law. It is to assert in the name of individual decision and conscience or sense of right or what you will, that not the past, but what we know to be true today must come into effect. There is still a good deal of hesitation in the Jewish community on the part of women's rights. But it is difficult to believe that one could do very much more than to justify that in any other way than prejudice or cultural lag. It is difficult to find any substance, particularly on the part of people who are willing to make other changes in Jewish law, as to why women should not have full and equal rights. Now, once one has said that, or any one of a number of similar cases, one has asserted the rights of individualism against the tradition. And what that means is a new form of Judaism comes into being. It is the Judaism that has been aborning the last 150 years or so. It is active, not passive. It is creative, and not essentially repetitive or merely creative by chance. The two great survival movements of modern Jewish life have been founded on the right of individuals to change and of people in a new time to do new things. The one is called Zionism, which breaks with the Jewish past, with the notion of the Messiah as the only significant political agent in the Jewish community. And the other is that series of movements connected with the reforms and liberalizations of Jewish religious life, which says that in the name of personal religious experience, rational or non-rational or what have you, religious life must be modified to meet the contemporary situation. Now, having made this case for individualism, what I am trying to do is to indicate why to talk about the Jewish future without paying attention to what individual Jews are doing is to miss what is going on in our very midst. For if the overwhelming number of American Jews are thinking in personal terms, a whole series of difficulties is created for the future of Jewish life. And these come out most notably in relationship to Jewish community and Jewish practice. We may have individuals who, as they like to call themselves, are Jewish in their heart, who feel Jewish. But that category of Jewish life has not had very high standing in our tradition. Our tradition has been very much more concerned with what one does, and what one does as part of the Jewish people, or specifically of the Jewish community of which one is a part. Let us take the classic case affecting the American Jewish community, namely the case of intermarriage. What is the apparently uncontrovertible rationale for intermarriage? If one person loves another person, and these two individuals are made for one another, are good for one another, seem to have a mature relationship with one another, why should a secondary factor, like what they happen to be born into, or the group of which they are a part, get in the way? The argument heard for intermarriage all the time on the part of people who wish to do so is that if this fulfills me as a person, and if good human relationships are so difficult to establish in our time anyway, why should the Jewish tradition object to that? Doesn't the Jewish tradition care about persons? Indeed, the respect for individualism goes so far that if one of the partners is a deeply concerned Jew, that person will very often hesitate even to suggest to the other partner that the other person, the non-Jew, might consider converting. It is almost coercive. The suggestion is considered almost coercive. Opening it up as a possibility sounds like infringing on the other's right to be themselves. As a result of which, very often partners who would like their spouse to be a Jew will not dare to say so. It is something they are not allowed to mention. And as a result, they then find themselves with a home in which there is a split religion among the parents, something that normally speaking they would be very disturbed about. When one is trying to have a family, one hopes to have a certain kind of integrity and unity in the whole, particularly where children are involved. Let us agree and have a joint policy to the children, but not in religion. Yet on the other hand, one has this curious anomaly. If the Jewish spouse is very much concerned about being Jewish, that the children, as apparently the statistics seem to indicate at the moment, in the overwhelming majority of cases, are being raised Jewish. Individualism and group loyalty and group practice here conflict. And the result is that the Jewish community suffers a great deal. When a demand made by Judaism, even liberalized Judaism now, conflicts seriously with what we take to be our individual good, Judaism is secondary or tertiary. In the American Jewish community, being Jewish must fit into what we are about as individuals. Indeed, now that we have added one new life phase and stage after another, I am old enough to remember when adolescence was discovered, when suddenly one was permitted to behave like a new sort of creature called an adolescent. And adolescents suddenly then became entitled to certain kinds of behaviors and rights. Well, consider how many new life stages we've gotten into. Each stage has its list of things that one is required to do. Almost none of them includes being a Jew. And if we are fortunate, perhaps we find some way of including it until one, as the expression goes, settles down. When one settles, Judaism very often is part of the settling down. So the dilemma that we face in the American Jewish community is as follows, as I see it. Regardless of what's going on in organizational life, at the root, we have Jews who are pursuing individual lifestyles, life goals, life functions, who are making their decisions in terms of what is right for them as individuals. And that is good. It is exceedingly valuable for the Jewish community, for in fact, that is the basis upon which the Jewish community has been allowed to participate in the general society. It has given us a sense of what it means to be a human being with a new and greater dignity, so that a person who takes away from us our right to make up our own minds or prevents us from acting upon what we know to be our best interest has substantially robbed us of our dignity. We are determined, the overwhelming majority of us, to be as positively functioning individuals as we can be. On the other hand, that individualism, that self-determination, flies in the face of the fact that Judaism is a community religion, one which emphasizes practice not only of an individual sort, but of a communal, historical, traditional sort. Now the question is, how can we put those together? That I see as the major challenge of the 1980s, and that is what I think certainly our institutions are incapable either of conceiving or dealing with. The answer which I wish to propose to that is an intellectual answer. It is a question of understanding ourselves and where we are going, and of now thinking it through from the standpoint of Judaism. We have a basis for beginning, in my opinion, in the fact that all around us, the confidence which drove us back to the self is now in turn collapsing. To put all this weight on the self, I can believe in very little around me that I must trust myself, is to make the self the agent, so to speak, of its own salvation. And it cannot take that weight. To make a God of the self is to ask the self to do a greater duty than it is capable of, and that explains the various kinds of panic and flight reactions we see around us. I give you three. The interests in psychological helps that we seek, if we could only come to better terms with ourselves, straighten out the emotional mechanisms, then perhaps our self would function better, and indeed it would function better. The trouble is that after we have cleared up the emotional difficulties, we run into the reality. Now that we no longer have the infantile overlay that we have put on the self, we suddenly discover simple and plain finitude, our limitation in the face of the ultimate ideals and perfectionist goals which stand in front of us. And that, if I may say so, has led to the second extraordinarily interesting flight of our time. I do not think you can understand the interest in UFOs and extraterrestrial phenomena without a theological analysis. You see, the truth is, humanism for our planet has run out. We know there's nobody down here to save us, not even us. Therefore, we hope that maybe somebody from another planet would have come to a higher level of civilization and have done what we can't do. Those nice creatures at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Time wouldn't dare to be hostile or nasty or vicious. They are rather the projection of our dream that somehow some marvelous other civilization created a childlike, decent, loving kind of being, which we know ourselves not to be. The humanism which runs out on Earth now seeks another planet to renew itself. And of course, the people who know that that is just kind of another false substitute God, then seek refuge in some sort of spiritual ideal in the cults which surround us, and which, interestingly enough, almost always turn out to be absolutisms. People do not these days, as they did in the 1930s, flee to religions promising broader freedom. They flee to religions where someone gives you the absolute truth, tells you what is right and wrong. In the case of the Reverend Moon, arranges your marriages and surrounds you with a community which holds you in love, certainly security, but binds you absolutely. It is a flight from the self, which can no longer bear the weight of being a civilized human being on its own. Now, it seems to me, recognizing that this self, which has been so critical to us, is now in extraordinary disrepair itself. It is time for a fundamental message to be brought by Judaism to the engaged individuals of our time, and to suggest that through the Jewish understanding of proper individualism, a new and appropriate balance will be worked out. Let us see some of the ways in which Judaism might now come to an accommodation with this modern way of understanding the dignity of the human being. In the first place, Judaism knows something about the ultimate dignity of every human being. For it knows to use the biblical language even for symbolic purposes, that every human being is created in the image of God, whatever that means. Every person has a grounding in transcendent reality. Not because of the way they look, not because of what they do, not because of what they produce, not because of who they know, not because of their power or impotence, not because of their age or stature, but by being. The simple fact of being bestows inalienable dignity on a human being. Now try that out on the next subway car you're riding on. To understand the Jewish teaching as against what our society believes, go face by face and person by person and bestow absolute dignity and worth on every single individual in the car. To recognize that as long as the self seeks to be grounded in itself, it will be empty and defeated, is to understand the possibility that if you have an intuition of the ultimate worthwhileness of every human being, that what you're talking about is one of the fundamental lessons of Jewish spirituality. And that is what makes the recovery of Jewish spirituality the ground of everything else that has to go on. Not all the love of the Jewish people, not all the acceptance of mitzvot, not all of the community responsibility for the state of Israel, for Soviet Jewry, for Jews in Argentina, or Jews imperiled anywhere in the world, including the United States. All that, for all it's worth, cannot take the place of this matter that we have been fleeing from. the accepted, long-standing, quiet premise of Jewish life that everyone is ultimately an agnostic, that we don't know and that we can't know, is obsolete. At one time, it didn't make any difference what you believed. Everybody knew what you needed to do. Today, we do not know what you need to do. And what you believe will determine, ultimately, whether everything is permitted or whether there are some limits to what you can do and still be a human being. The agnostic option relied on the security of human reason or the onward march of Western civilization or the goodness of human nature. Everything that we have slowly and painfully had to give up over the last 15 years. First and foremost is the recovery of a spirituality which will restore dignity to every human being, including ourselves. Second, even though that human dignity is to be found in being, just being there, it is confirmed in doing. For Judaism, it is not simply having some inner experience, feeling it, moving with it, enjoying it, wallowing in it, riding that wave. That is the sign of a true human being. It is rather the self as capable of doing an act. God is such an extraordinary figure in the Bible because God is so busy. God cannot be passive. God is another active Jewish doer, setting the model for you and me. To see to it that if we are truly to have dignity, we must do what no other creature can do. Determine what it is that we know from our depth and our height as we reach out for it, is the good, and accomplishing it. The Jewish tradition has this extraordinary notion of the human being, the self, as co-creator with God of righteousness in the earth. To be able to do the good and to carry it out is the single most critical thing about being a Jew. Now, once being is related to doing, we come to the third Jewish emphasis, which is the emphasis upon not only being true to self, but of recognizing self as intimately linked with others. Compare the contemporary world and its mood about what it is to be a self. We think in almost every relationship, what is it doing for me? A perfectly intelligent question. As long as it is also linked up with what am I doing for others? What happens to me in relationship to others? If everyone else exists as a means to my satisfaction and fulfillment, then I have as good as made myself God and taken God's place. For all human beings and creatures exist to serve me. To be a creature, to recognize that one is not God, is to recognize that, yes, one has one's enjoyments, but that one fulfills oneself in relationship to other human beings. There are many ways of doing that. One is part of a family. One has one's parents, those hordes of Jewish aunts and uncles and cousins and nephews and nieces. with whom one is involved somehow biologically. One has the Jewish community, this people of which one is a sometimes unwilling part. One is part of a community in which one lives, Jewish, non-Jewish, all God's creatures, all involved in trying to do the work of righteousness. One is involved with a nation which is trying to live out its historic destiny. One is part of humankind. For Judaism, you would not be the you are if it had not been for all of these people. Without context, you are nothing. And therefore, without participating as self in the social, is to be nothing. One cannot be a self from the Jewish point of view without being a social self. And that leads us forth to the notion that the self is immersed in history. Time, long-range time, is a critical factor in Jewish selfhood. That's why the Bible is so filled with history. Years and centuries go by as the biblical religious tale is told. A person does not start everything. A person does not finish everything. One is in one's individuality part of what has been going on for centuries, and through one will pass the history that will long succeed one. In our life today, it is very difficult to believe for many people that time has any serious significance. They think only in terms of the present. Now, what is happening now? What is the satisfaction now? What is the reward now? If I am not being rewarded now, why should I be involved? The past seems only a prelude to the present. The self is here immediately. And the future has not yet come. There is no future for the self, for the self must function at this given moment. Therefore, to become part of a sweep of history seems somehow wrong. And we emphasize then consuming and enjoying and evaluating the situation in terms of what happens at this moment. For the Jewish tradition, every individual comes into the world as part of humankind. And every Jew comes into the world as part of a project which depends upon that Jew. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Akiba, Maimonides, Moses, Mendelssohn depend upon these immediate Jews carrying on. If they stop, all that is lost. And it must yet be carried on for the Messiah to come. No Jewish generation can fail to carry out its responsibility, or every other Jewish generation has as good as failed. Jewish history moves through the Jewish individuals. That is to put a cosmic scope on being a person. And it is important to recognize that that too can ask too much of us. For if I and my generation are responsible for making it possible for the Messiah yet to come, of being true to all those Jews of the past, we fail so often, so ignobly, that it is easy to be lost in the sense of what we cannot do. When we retreat into selfhood, we seem to have two major modes. On the one hand, we are messianic. Now we think to ourselves, just think of what I can do. I didn't realize what the possibilities of. The world is before me. I shall seize the hour. I shall try a new attempt. I don't need to live the old way. I will make and create a new world. and trying it and failing as we often do, recognizing how self-defeating and self-destructive we are, we become depressed. What an extraordinary thing it is that the major psychic phenomenon of our age is no longer oppressive guilt. We do not take command that seriously that we get very guilty. But taking the self very seriously and doing very badly with it, we get very depressed. For when the self fails us, what is left if all one believes in is the self? The Jewish tradition understands that we are all creatures, that the ultimate outcome of human history depends not upon us and our righteousness. To be sure, it will not be accomplished unless we do what we need to do. But we are not alone in human history. We are only part of the partnership. We are related to a transcendent other with which we are cooperating. And to use the language of our tradition, creating us, it understands us and our limits, to put it more directly. For he knoweth our frame. He remembereth that we are but dust and ashes. O Lord, if thou wouldst mark iniquities, who could stand before you? But with thee is forgiveness, that thou mayest be revered. The Jewish tradition knows that we are not only the potential creators of righteousness, but sinners prone again and again and again to go against the best of what we know to be true. But with the capacity every time to turn in repentance, to apologize, to start again, to have our dignity not in achieving the good, but in starting again and again and again and again from our failures to do what needs to be done. It is a realistic Jewish tradition which calls upon us to recognize the evil of which we are capable and to recognize that with a sincere resolve, even that evil cannot separate us from our dignity or from the God who gives us our basic worth. And that, finally, leads us to the great Jewish message of our time. It is the notion that in the midst of the stupidity, the filth, the terror, the violence, the incompetence, the disgusting disillusionments day by day of our time, we will not ultimately be defeated. A Jew has hope, even today. Even in New York, even at night having to go home, even to having to get up tomorrow morning to face transportation, to face the petty indignities of existence, the struggle simply to remain a human being in this situation. To have hope in the midst of all that is to have an extraordinarily precious ingredient. For if the Jewish tradition has known anything over the centuries, it is to understand that despite what happens in human history, we are not defeated, for we are not the ultimate actor. And if any generation of Jews ought to know that we will not be defeated, and with us humanity will not be defeated, it is the Jewish community of our time. For out of the Holocaust, survivors came who would not turn their backs on history, who took up the challenge of being human in an inhuman history, who determined to build despite a destruction greater than anything human history had ever recorded. And we are the community related to the state of Israel, that indomitable group of our brothers and sisters, who in the face of the most extraordinary political and economic and military pressures, nonetheless manage to try to be decent human beings who will also stand their grounds and demand their rights. To survive the 1980s as a self, a rich, vital, living, vibrant self, one needs this Jewish message of hope. And these things, it seems to me, Judaism might bring and say to an American Jewish community which is now necessarily founded on the self, but is facing the problems of a self which no longer can bear the burdens which have been erected on it. So, what this might produce, then, is a Jew who could learn to live with the new grant of individual freedom that our society has given, which has produced this tremendous gain which Jews have benefited from, and yet which at the same time threatens the very roots of our continued Jewish existence. If our American Jewish community could recapture in this personal, spiritual, believing way these Jewish roots of the self, it might then create a new kind of Jew. One who could channel individual freedom through a Jewish understanding of reality, and as a result learn how to make Jewish and not only individual choices. For now we would have people who were selves, not just in terms of themselves alone, but someone who recognized that their selfhood was based upon a relationship to God as part of the Jewish people, fulfilling the past of that people, moving toward that people's future. Selfhood linked to God and group and history and goal. That will not give us Jewish law as we once had. We cannot reclaim that law as long as we believe in individualism. But we can overcome anarchy. We can create the possibility of Jewish community and Jewish continuity with a very genuine sense of pluralism if the selves of Jews are founded in Jewish faith and therefore channeled in this way through Jewish boundaries and limits and goals and values in decision. And that is why I differ with Irving Greenberg. He thinks, essentially, to overstate, that the decision lies with organizations and getting organizations to help Jews do things. I think the fundamental problem of Jewish life is the inherent conflict in our affirmation of the self and our desire to be Jews. In meeting that problem, in resolving it, we look to the Jewish future. And now I've left some time to take your questions and comments, and I'll be delighted to do so if I can ever find a way to see through my glasses. Charles wants to know why it was that when I was here in November, I emphasized personal autonomy, and it sounded to him like at that point I was talking about the conflict of claims between personal autonomy and the tradition, for which my usual term would be covenant, and which he is now very strongly equating with institutions and structures. And I want to make a couple of comments about that. The first comment is, I thought I was only extending my remarks of November, but I decided that people will get bored if every time I get up to speak I use the word autonomy. So I set myself a new verbal task this evening. Instead of talking about autonomy, I decided to try talking about being an individual and being true to oneself and self-determining. And I suggest you just read that whole tape back, and all that's autonomy. Now that's the one part of it. I think autonomy is the key issue. Autonomy is the technical term for deciding for yourself. Auto, self, nomi, law. Self-law. Make your own law. Okay? Now, but what I mean by covenant is quite precisely relationship. Covenant, God, Jewish people. And Jewish people with its past and future, as well as the Jewish communities that exist today. So I think I'm saying the exact same thing. Now, where we need now to do a little dickering is with regard to the role of institutions and structures. Why do I leave them almost entirely out of what I am talking about? In the first place, because Yitz talked about it at such length. And in the second place, because most Jews are not going to listen to me anyway. Most Jews like organizations and structures and temples and committees and activities. You don't have to worry so much about people falling into this. That's where the overwhelming majority of people feel at home. Every intellectual Jew I know of, most Jewish intellectuals I know of go around complaining about Jewish institutions all the time. Temples are awful, rabbis are impossible, who wants to sit on another committee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, they keep going on forever and ever. I mean, do you really think, after everything that everybody has said about giving another award in the Jewish community, that we will not next year go on giving new plaques and new awards to new people who will be terribly moved and thrilled by it? No, I don't think anybody needs to defend the institutionalization of Jewish life. That's going to go on. So, if you don't mind, I think I'll take that for granted on a simple sociological, historical, structural level. What I did want to do was to make a proper philosophical case for it. You see, only if the self has a social responsibility is there any basis for institutions. The real challenge to institutions in our time is we come to every institution on the basis of what does it do for me as an individual and a person. Until we overcome the notion that everything has to do something for me personally, we're not going to have any vital institutional life. Therefore, I am far more concerned with the difficult problem of why is it that all of us have to put up with a certain amount of institutional crud. And the reason for that is that a self is not a self without others. Now, if a self is not a self without others, and you need to be part of the Jewish community's historical role, you will have to get involved in what we call an institution of some kind or another. And the same thing is true with regard to deed, which I emphasize. But let us put first things first. The institution should be judged in terms of the Jewish self. Acts should be judged in terms of the Jewish self. Therefore, I think defining the Jewish self is the critical question. Yes, sir. No, I don't do so. In other words, I assume that most people in our society are going to continue to function in a secular way, have done so, we're going to continue to do so, and on the whole it won't work out badly. It is working out more badly regularly, I think. And the reason it won't work out badly is the following. There has been a sufficient investment of capital of what I even publicly will call the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is to say, that tradition in this country which looks to the Hebrew Bible for its standards for society and community. That's what I mean by that. There's been a sufficient investment of that Hebrew communal sense in this society that even when people stop believing it, they still hold those values. I think we can keep getting along quite adequately without religion as long as we don't reflect too much on where the values come from. But why should psychiatrists want to bring families together? That is too crude. Let us assume that they are as decent as you and I are. Where does suddenly this commitment to families come from? Where does the notion of health come from? Where do the implicit values of even secular therapy come from? Let us take a simple case. R.D. Lang says that maybe a fragmented self, schizophrenic, schizoid, various kind, is far more realistic way of meeting the kinds of lives we live than an integrated self. Why do you prefer an integrated personality to a fragmented personality? I will tell you. Because there is one God, and oneness is the model of personality for us, not fragmentation. Now, please don't tell that to your secular therapist tomorrow. It will obviously indicate that you want to deal with meta-psychological issues, and that is obviously a defense against facing reality. Yes, sir. Yeah, well, I think you catch one of the fundamental problems. But let me come back. First, let us clear up a difference between what you were asking about and what I was talking about. I was not discussing the issue of freedom of choice. Yes, Judaism does believe very strictly in freedom of choice. What Judaism does not believe in at all is that you have freedom of choice as to which law you will follow or which law you will not follow. What Judaism does not believe is that if the law is inconvenient for you, you have a choice not to follow it. I mean, you have the choice to sin. That's a different kind of choice. Moreover, if you think the law is wrong, is immoral, or just dumb. The Jewish law is marvelous, for example, when it comes to saving a life on the Sabbath. Terrific. It knows the difference between keeping the law and saving a life. You save a life, break anything in sight. You must do it. Terrific. But if you don't have to save a life, you can't do very much. You can't carry an umbrella when it rains. I know you may get pneumonia, but you can't carry an umbrella. Why can't you carry an umbrella? In the first place, you may not be allowed to carry in public. Let us assume, as in Manhattan, although there's some debate, it is all private property. It's been arranged by legal fiction to make it all private property so you can carry now. You could carry the umbrella, but you can't open it. Why can't you open it? Because that's the equivalent of making a tent. Making a tent is one of the 39 categories of law you're not allowed to do. Now, I understand that there are some people who will take that to be God's law. I have respect for them for following it. To me, it seems human and dumb. And so I will not only carry my umbrella, but I will open it and close it and open it and close it in order to get to shore. Okay, but now the minute you've done that, you have introduced the question of the individual and the law. Now, I would agree with you. Yes, this should not be allowed to remain a generality. Yes, this should be made detailed. And now that's where the question comes down to more specific guidance. Here, I think, in the first place, a matter of temperament comes in. Some people are more inclined to go along with tradition if there's no reason to change it, whereas others are more inclined to try to feel their own way. I think that should be allowed as long as these are serious-minded Jews who are concerned with their relationship to God as part of the Jewish people, its past, its present community, and the future. And that's what we mean by pluralism. This is where the guidance of the past comes in. But you see, my sense of the self, if you situate yourself inside the Jewish community, then you will say to yourself, I am not the first Jew to live in this covenant relationship. Other Jews have lived in this covenant relationship. I am not the only Jew today to be living in the covenant relationship. There are all those Jews out there. I will therefore make a large number of my decisions doing what other Jews have done in the past and today, but not always. And every once in a while, I will do things no Jew ever thought of doing. Now, let me give you my favorite example of American Jewish religious creativity. If you go to a conservative Reconstructionist or a Reformed congregation, at the end of the service, there is likely to be a prayer. No one ever heard of that until Jews discovered that Protestants had benedictions. So we now have a prayer at the end. We learned that. Listen, you can object to another Jewish prayer? No. But if you listen, comes the end of the prayer, every Amen, Good Shabbos or Shabbat Shalom, and then you hear all over the congregation. It's almost indecent if you're near your spouse. I mean, how would you not reach over and kiss? Who thought of that? Where did that come from? First place, against Jewish law. You shouldn't be seated next to your wife to begin with. No Jewish organization ever sent out a resolution to people. Wouldn't it be nice as a sign and symbol of Sabbath reconciliation, if, no matter what you said to each other in your car on the way over to synagogue, assuming you drove, that at the end of services, the two of you symbolically created an act of Sabbath peace. See, no Jewish organization ever did that. But somehow those Jews out there, living the reality of Jewish life, discovered that after services they ought to kiss. Of course, in the suburbs we kind of pass it around and have the equivalent of a Jewish synagogue orgy, but that's just our way of being friendly. Now you see, that's the kind of thing that if you only relied on the past could never happen. But now not only has happened, but is probably the most sensible thing of very many other sensible things that we have done. Please. I caught that. Yeah, in fact, we do not disagree, really. It is a question of emphasis and of how really to handle it. You see, what I wanted to do this evening, as you can see we are winding up, what I wanted to do this evening was to focus on something that most people in the Jewish community don't focus on. A lot of people talk about organizations, very few as well as Yitz Greenberg did 3 weeks ago, and very few with that sense of spirit and deep understanding of both the metaphysical level of the Jewish commitment as well as its forward dedication and historical experience. Very few people want to talk about, and almost no one wants to talk about, the question of the crisis of the Jewish community in terms of what we believe. That's why I focused on what I wanted, on what I determined to talk about this evening. So that's the first comment. Second comment is, I did not mean to put organizations down. I said as I began that I wanted to exaggerate a bit. Yes, I think we need to have Jewish organizations. I happen to be an organization person. I mean, I've been a Jewish bureaucrat. I work in a Jewish institution. In fact, I operate a little Jewish institution of my own, although it is a kind of an oddball activity called Shema Magazine, which the overwhelming majority of Jewish organizations find they cannot support for fairly obvious reasons, since we would like to be free to criticize whoever needs to have criticism. Not a favorite activity of most Jewish organizations I know. Yes, we obviously have, you can't have Jewish people and Jewish historic continuity without institutions. The point that I wanted to make was, I run into lots of people who keep waiting for an answer to arrive from New York or Washington, D.C. As if something doesn't happen in New York or Washington, D.C., Jewish life will go under. Now, the only way I can describe that is positively out of an appreciation of what Jewish organizations have done, but negatively as infantilism. In almost any other aspect of our life, we have learned that we need to be substantially self-determining. And I think what we need to do in relationship to our organizations, indeed our good organizations will be interested in it and care about it, and if they can stand it, will stimulate it. Namely, to teach people to think for themselves and to understand for themselves and to be self-determining of their Jewish duties. But, and that brings me to what I consider to be the crux, most people are thinking in unreflected Western civilizational, particularly American terms about the self. And until we learn to think more Jewishly about the self, we will not understand how to deal with this difficulty. And that brings me to the final joy and blow of the evening. Very often, I think I somehow do not make myself clear. It is a pleasure to discover that at least my 6 points got through to somebody tonight. So I'm delighted at least for that. But while I like the fact that you got the 6 points and that you recognize them as the heart of the Jewish tradition, yes, in fact, what I was saying was traditional for all its lingo. The notion that the Jewish community is able in any effective way to talk in terms of the self, I would have to deny. Until relatively recent years, the Jewish community always spoke in terms of ethics. Whatever we did, it made you ethical. The Shabbat made you ethical. Keeping kosher was a little more ethical way of eating. Ethical monotheism was the single basic idea of the Jewish community. Everything was ethics. And to this day, when people want to talk about Judaism, they will talk about the way in which it gives you moral character strength. In more recent years, we have kind of sloughed over that language and picked up another language, and it is the language of peoplehood. We're the Jewish people, and we are entitled to be a people like all other people are entitled to be people. We have to participate in our ethnic activities, and we will enrich our lives by having this kind of ethnic association. And isn't ours a wonderful ethnic group? Other ethnic groups emphasize their things. We have bar mitzvahs and Talmud Torah and an extraordinary number of Nobel Prize winners. The notion that the Jewish community has talked about the self can be refuted just simply by asking yourself, what is the normal Jewish attitude to Martin Buber? Martin Buber, who more than any other single person has created this sense of the self, the understanding of the self as linked in dialogue and as part of a covenant relationship, is generally understood in the Jewish community to be for Gentiles. Buber is a theologian for Christians. Why? Because, on the whole, most Jews have not been willing to give up their agnosticism. The issue on the surface is Jewish law. Buber doesn't have Jewish law, neither do most Jews. The underlying issue is the issue that Buber says there is ultimately no self without a relationship to God, even if that relationship is worked out to others. Now, one thing almost everybody in the Jewish community has been running away from for decades now, and that is, what do you believe about God? Where do you stand on the issue of God? The idea of God, a kind of a throwaway. God is somehow a positive power working in nature. Whew. I don't have to worry about God, and all I do is care about nature. But Buber insists that the issue of God is paramount in talking about the self. In my opinion, that's what's made him so goyish. Protestants talk about God. Jews talk about law, as if you can long have law without God. The crisis of the Jewish community, in my opinion, has been the fact that gradually, in our folk songs, in our rock lyrics, if you can stand listening to them, everybody now begins to talk about self, about being a person, about not being treated as an object, about being fulfilled, of having relationships. Everybody begins to understand that. But talking of Judaism in those terms, of understanding relationship on a personal basis as the way of combining what the society has taught us is worthwhile about the self, while at the same time correcting it in terms of a Jewish emphasis that we have not heard. I think. But I came here to tell you what I think, and I have sufficient trust in your self-determination that I am convinced that you will decide for yourself, even in my presence, what you believe. Thank you very much for coming.